Freedom and you. Welcome, Swagatham, Vanakkam, Vande Mataram. Every year we celebrate the attainment of our freedom. As citizens, we are legitimately proud of being free from foreign domination. And yet, all the leading thinkers of our freedom movement were also clear that mere political freedom without the other modes of freedom, namely economic freedom, social freedom, cultural freedom, religious freedom, political freedom would either be unstable or without any substance. And more than anyone else, predictably, understandably, Bhimrao Ambedkar was particularly clear and keen about it. Since my viewers would be familiar with the various insights of B.R. Ambedkar on this subject, I will not tax their memory or waste their time by going into a recounting of the major aspects. At any rate, all of us are familiar that B.R. Ambedkar certainly harbored the apprehension that in a society where inequalities, gross inequalities, are so deeply entrenched, human liberty would be in a very, very precarious state. And therefore, citizens have to be particularly vigilant about safeguarding their freedom. Both Nehru and Ambedkar were one in this particular instance, and they were certainly like Gandhi in this respect, that human freedom should not be taken for granted. The significance of Gandhi is that he understood freedom to be a spiritual phenomenon, a spiritual thing, and therefore he believed, and quite rightly too, that if the spiritual foundation of freedom is compromised, freedom would collapse or evaporate sooner or later. And this is a warning, this is an insight that we need to be particularly aware of, mindful of, especially in the unprecedented ascendancy of the materialistic culture. The problem being that materialism is the ideology and worldview or way of life counter to the spiritual worldview, and therefore materialism breeds various forms of slavery, the foremost of which is the consumerist slavery, the slavery that every citizen experiences in a free world, of being slaves to this items of delight or that items of pride and covetousness. The feeling that I can't live without this consumerist item. So, today more than ever before, various sections of the Indian society feel, for whatever reasons, they have their reasons, as we are aware, that their freedom is at risk. This is a problem experienced not only by religious minorities and in particular Muslims and Christians, who are within the minorities, the designated minorities, which are 5 national minorities, treated as a separate category on the basis that their fatherland and their holy land are outside the geographical limits of India. This is a Hindutva idea that those who have their Pitrabhumi and Punyabhumi outside the limits of India's geography shall not be and should not be eligible for citizenship. If at all they choose to live in India, they can only be second class citizens or state subjects who are not entitled to protection within the ambit of the Constitution of India. Now therefore, this problem is not only limited to religious minorities. It is now experienced by various groups including Dalits, Adivasis, and general groups like farmers and to a certain extent now even the educated youth, because unemployment is a form of unfreedom. People don't realize that work is significant, extremely significant from the perspective of freedom. And if you want to know more about it, I would refer you to Bertrand Russell's book Political Ideals, where he feels that one of the most important aspects of freedom in the modern times is the freedom to work, because it's only through work that human beings are able to express themselves. So the right to self-expression is meaningless unless there is meaningful and significant work to do. Therefore, educated youths consigned to languish in a state of unemployment are actually in a state of bondage, unfreedom. Their freedom is a teasing illusion. So, we have to really look at freedom in a much enlarged paradigm or perspective. So, therefore, the point I am making is that more than ever before, citizens are becoming aware of the endangered state of their personal liberties. That's the context within which I undertake this reflection. Therefore, I hope the substance of this reflection would make a direct sense to all my viewers. Now, what I want to submit is a very simple strain of thought, very easy to remember, and you can actually meditate on these on this line of thought far beyond what I would care to or I would be able to explain within the ambit of a small video. Everybody cherishes freedom. At the same time, very few are in a position to enjoy freedom in a meaningful fashion. Theoretically, we are all free, but to what extent we are really free and to what purpose is a very problematic issue. Now, looking at the contemporary political situation, the dynamics that's playing out within that context, I would like to argue that there are two major pitfalls to our entitlement to freedom. Please, please, please make note of this. There are two major pitfalls to our constitutionally guaranteed entitlement to personal freedom. What are they? We must think very clearly in a chiseled manner on the subject, because it is very tricky and at the same time it's very crucial, and anything that happens to this, it will be a major tragedy for every citizen and ultimately for the country. The two major pitfalls are security on the one hand and poverty on the other. Now, let me explain. I went to Delhi in 1971. I landed there on the 9th of April 1971. I joined St. Stephen's College in July of 1971. But by December, Delhi was under curfew. The India-Pakistan war happened, and that is a war through which East Pakistan was liberated, transforming that into the present day Bangladesh. So, India was under curfew for about 12 days. Now, you know that life and personal liberties are seriously limited, freedoms are curtailed, and not only curtailed, virtually abolished during a period of curfew. But nobody resented it. Why? Because everybody could see that it was necessary to ensure our security. For example, curfew means that after 6 o'clock you are not allowed to switch on an electric light or even to light a match or smoke a cigarette if you are fond of or addicted to smoking. No light could be seen of any kind. Now imagine having to live like that. But nobody minded it because it was directly connected to security. So, for the point I am making is that if a party or a government or a coalition can aggravate the sense of insecurity of a people, that they will be willing, on their own, they will be willing to compromise their freedom. Now, in this perspective, let us look at some of the strategies used by Sri Narendra Modi and company. For the last several years, the Hindus were being told that they are in a serious state of risk because there is a threat from religious minorities, particularly Muslims and Christians. Muslims want to overproduce and upset the demographic balance of India, and eventually, by overpopulation, overtake Muslims and become once again the rulers of India. And Hindus, who constitute 80%, the brutal majority of India, will become slaves to Muslims by 2050. This is a prediction. On what basis? Nobody knows. But there are thousands, millions of people who have swallowed this absolute canard. Now, this accusation cannot be made against Christians because Christians are actually dwindling. And even so, something else is invented for the sake of creating insecurity with regard to Christians in the Hindu mind. And that is, Christians are experts in converting people, and slowly they are eating up the Hindu community, and eventually they will succeed in wiping out Hinduism from the land of its birth. Now, there are millions who believe in this with their eyes closed. The national data says something to the contrary. Christians were 3.64% in the 1961 census. In the 2011 census, Christians are 2.18%. So, rather than increasing in numbers, Christians are dwindling. But the propaganda of a particular, from a certain quarter, has succeeded in persuading many, in fact, lakhs and lakhs of Hindus, that Christians are converting left, right and center, and therefore they are very fast eating up, gobbling up the Hindu community, and there will be no Hindu left. And this is what is called the strategy of aggravating insecurity. Now consider some of the speeches made by the Honorable Prime Minister even as the election process was on. In a speech made in Bikaner, Rajasthan, he said that if the Congress is voted back to power and the India Alliance is voted back to power, they will snatch the Mangal Sutra of your daughters and your wives, and they will take away the party will take away all your wealth and distribute it among Hindus, among Muslims. Later on in another speech, the Prime Minister said that if the Congress comes back to power, they will put the Babri Masjid lock on the Ayodhya temple, and so on and so forth. Now, if you look at the common psychology in all of this, it is, or the psychology that is common to all these statements, it is the intent to activate and aggravate insecurity. How is that politically profitable? If you can infect a community, the majority community in particular, with this virus of fear, virus of insecurity, then they will be willing to compromise their freedom, personal freedom, and embrace the leadership of the strong man, which image is already assiduously propagated. So, on the one hand, the people are infected with insecurity. On the other hand, the leader is invested with superhuman powers, godlike faculties. So, there is a messiah for the insecure people, and the two together will ensure a huge electoral windfall. It's a simple strategy. It's tested time and again in history. It has yielded very rich dividends. So, there is nothing clever, nothing new, nothing unusual, nothing hidden. It is so very simple, it is so very obvious, though people may not realize when this is afoot, when this is actually playing out. People may not connect one to the other and read the actual logic at work. Now, what happens to Hinduism under the stewardship of these people who are infecting the Hindu community with insecurity, sort of highlighting the hypothetical threat held out by Muslims and Christians. To what extent is the essence of Hinduism safe in the hands of these people, the self-appointed, self-styled messiahs and protectors of Hinduism, is an entirely different question. And people will not ask such questions because when people repose their faith in the center of power driven by insecurity, the one thing that they lose is the capacity to think coolly and rationally. And it's only when people think rationally and factually that the question of raising some questions would arise. Otherwise, it doesn't arise at all, and therefore, predictably, understandably, questions are not being asked. And it's not difficult to understand why. So, that's the connection between insecurity and liberty. Insecurity creates a psychology in which individuals will readily part with their freedom, repose everything on the leader who can then absolutize his power and his control over them, which actually then creates this hallucination of divinity in the supreme leader. Of that we are now by now familiar. I don't have to say anything more about it. The second issue that modifies freedom is poverty. Now, in every society, if you examine history, you will find people all over the world in every age without exception have ascribed first importance to bread and only secondary importance to freedom. If you are starving, if you haven't eaten a meal for a day or 2 days, someone shows a piece of bread and then asks, will you part with your freedom if I give you this bread? You say, yes, take my freedom. I'm willing to be a bond slave forever. Give me that bread, give me that bread. So, there is a politics, what I call the politics of poverty. Absolute freedom, absolute authority, absolute dictatorship, absolute tyranny will always flourish in the context of widespread poverty. Now, French Revolution, the background of French Revolution, all of us are familiar with. The French kings could exalt themselves, increase their political power, become tyrannical, as in the case of Louis XIV, when the suffering of the people, their destitution, their poverty peaked and people began to cry out to the king for help. That's when Marie Antoinette said, if you don't have bread to eat, eat cake. That's a kind of, now that arrogance can come only when two things coexist. One is the abject poverty of the people and the unlimited absolute power of the king. And the two are connected. In a society where citizens are developed educationally, economically, it's impossible for the ruler to absolutize his power because citizens will resist it both at the individual level and collectively. They'll come together and resist and bridle the power of the king. Therefore, all kings who were interested in absolute rule were also interested in keeping the people backward. Now, for example, in the national budget presented yesterday, the 23rd of July, the one thing I was looking for all the time was the allocation for education and health. And as I expected, the allocation for education and health has come down as compared to even the previous budget. Instead of increasing, it is decreasing, though the new education policy mandates a significant increase of input budgetary allocation for education, and great fanfare was made about the new education policy, how this is going to transform India, how the government is committed to it. But the real intentions are revealed through the budget, where the allocation to education is cut. Even in the last budget, the money set apart or allocated for education was not fully utilized. It's not only that the allocation to education is meager, as against 6% of the GDP, Even today it's less than 3% of the GDP, but even the allocation of less than 3% of the GDP is not fully utilized, which then becomes the alibi, the excuse for downscaling, downsizing the budgetary allocation for health in the ensuing budget, as it happened in the present budget. The same thing happened with respect to health. The two things that affect the welfare of citizens, particularly the middle class down, are education and health. And any government that is really mindful of the welfare of the people would give maximum priority to education and health. But in this budget, as in several budgets before, least priority, laughable priority is ascribed to education and health. Now, therefore, I am driven to the conclusion that the helplessness of the people, the economic helplessness of the people, on the one hand, unprecedented levels of unemployment. As per the education survey tabled in the parliament, 9.2% of India's educated youth are unemployed. 9.2%. It's a shocking level of unemployment. So, unemployment on the one side, the deprivation of a very large section of the Indian population, the farmers. You remember the farmers' agitation in which 700 people died? The denuding and the deprivation of rural India, where 60% of the population is resident, making people run for their life, the mass migration of the workforce from rural area, the migrant laborers, they're all over India, Punjab, Haryana, Kerala, and other places, which actually prevents them from voting, which is another political issue. I don't want to take that up, maybe on a future occasion. Now, the point I'm making is that this kind of economic disarray, the state of absolute helplessness to which a majority of the people are today consigned, by the government's own admission, 80 crore people, 800 million people are subsisting on the 5 kilograms ration which the government provides, without which they will be in a state of starvation. So, through this arrangement, 80 crore people, 800 million people of Indians are made to live dependent on the charity of the state, charity of the provider, the Prime Minister's Yojana, Prime Minister's Yojana. There's a politics in this. So, in this state of helplessness, those who are so afflicted, those who find it so difficult somehow to live and complete a day, they will not be reluctant to compromise their freedom in order to ensure 3 meals a day. So, it's possible to influence voting patterns by providing free rations. Whereas, if you really look at it in an objective perspective, such a large chunk of the population of India having to subsist on the charity of the government is an insult to the dignity of India. But nobody will think in that manner. People will praise those in authority for their generosity, for their compassion, for their pro-people, pro-poor policies in distributing food, subsidized food or free food. No one asks the question, why is it that these people who are such skilled workers, who are keen to work, they have to live dependent on the charity of somebody else? Nobody asks that question. That's a question to be asked though. So, what I am saying is, 3 principles I want to flag. 1, if the authority of the apex center of power is to increase, if the power of the man at the top is to increase, that power has to be borrowed or taken away from the people. So, even as the ruler's power increases, the people's power decreases, number 1. Number 2, in order to inflate the power of the ruler and to decrease the power of the people, 2 strategies are used all through history. It's not, I'm not talking about one particular country. You can apply this pattern to any country in the world. The first strategy is the strategy of aggravating insecurity. Something terrible is going to happen to you. Something terrible is going to happen to you. And I am your savior. So trust me with your eyes closed and give me all the power that I need in order to help you. It's for your sake. I am not interested in power, but for your sake I need to have absolute power. The second strategy, and that's the third point I want to make. Second strategy is the aggravation of people's economic well-being, which makes their day-to-day survival such a hard struggle, and which breeds economic dependence on the center of power. So that even a poor man in an obscure village has to depend on Delhi, the charity of Delhi. And this is somehow hailed to be a great arrangement. Now, this is a serious, implicit, if not explicit, assault on personal liberty. The meaning of liberty I will explain in another unit, another video. What does liberty mean? It's very rarely understood. People don't really understand these very basic things, even though these are the things that we have attached our hearts and our souls to. We need clarity of thought in these very difficult and confusing times. The very business of propaganda is to get an entire nation confused, because it's only in a state of confusion that people can be led by their nose and made to reach where not they but somebody else want them to reach, which is again a pattern of bondage or slavery. So please pay attention to these very evident patterns that are at work all around you. See, when things happen right in front of our eyes, unless and until we have a conceptual framework, we will not be able to connect one to the other and get to the meaning of it. Meaning always rests in connecting the various dots. If you look at one dot, then another dot in a disconnected manner, you will never get the meaning of it. Our attempt here is to connect the dots and to look at the shape of things so that we can understand the meaning thereof. So that's where it is. Freedom is under siege. Personal liberties are in serious jeopardy, and the logic for whitewashing it, to make it seem a very, very benign and healthy thing, is also at work. And citizenship responsibilities and inspired selfishness both demand that we understand what is happening and why these things are being done in this manner and what will be the final consequence. So I've shared with you what little I know, and I submit the rest to your investigation and to your continued reflection. Thank you very much for abiding with me in this journey of seeking, sharing and celebrating. Jai Hind.